So now that you know what Flutter is and what you can do with it, it's time to get started with it. And for that, you need to install a couple of tools. In this video here, I'll give you the high-level overview. In the next video, I will walk you through all the setup steps needed on Windows machines. In the video thereafter, I'll cover macOS, and of course, you can skip the lecture that you don't need. If you're on a macOS device, you can skip the Windows lecture and vice versa. Here in this lecture, as mentioned, you get the big picture, and then after those next lectures, where I show you the exact steps, we'll get started creating a new Flutter project and previewing our first Flutter app. So therefore, in order to get there, let's start diving into those general setup steps. And here, the first step, as you will see in those next lectures, is always to download and install the Flutter SDK, the Flutter Software Development Kit. And that includes Flutter itself, so this SDK itself, so this collection of tools and this Flutter framework, which I mentioned earlier. But it also means that you will need to install Git, which is a version control software that is generally totally independent from Flutter. It's a software you can use in general as a developer to, for example, create code snapshots to which you can go back if you mess something up in your code, for example. But Flutter, these Flutter tools which you also install, actually use this Git software internally, which is why you will need to install that. Again, I will show you the concrete steps and will show you how to install Git in those next lectures. I'm just mentioning it here already. Now with that, you would have Flutter installed, and that would be enough to write the code. But in order to also build the app for different platforms, and in order to preview the app whilst you're working on it, you also need to install some platform-specific tools. For example, as you will also see in those next lectures, you will need to install Android Studio to build and test Android apps. And you will need to install Xcode for macOS to build and test iOS apps. As mentioned before, for iOS apps, you will not be able to install Xcode on Windows and Linux. You will need a macOS device for that. And that's why I mentioned that you can only preview and really build those iOS apps if you are on a Mac. The code is the same, but these tools can only be installed there. For Android apps, you don't have these restrictions. There you can install and configure Android Studio no matter on which machine you are. Now, once you have these platform tools installed, there's just one last missing step, and that would be to set up some virtual devices, some emulators on your system. For example, an Android emulator to preview your Flutter project as an Android app, running locally on a virtual device on your machine. For iOS, you would create an iOS simulator, and I will also show you how to do that in those next lectures. Using such virtual devices instead of your real phone is very useful, because that means that you don't have to use your real phone for testing, and that you instead can use this virtual device, which can also easily be erased if you need to, and which is a great tool for testing your Flutter project as you're working on the code. That's the theory. In the next lecture, we'll take a look at the Windows setup, and thereafter, we'll take a look at the macOS setup, before we then thereafter take a look at how to create projects with Flutter and how to work with those projects.